Prison Days, Book 12. Introduction. An entire year of prison days. Has it really been that long? This series has come so far, and yet I still think back to that very first moment I wrote about, way back in Book 1. The moment I arrived at the prison for the very first time for a free information night. It seems like such a long time ago, and yet there it is, clear as day when I close my eyes and remember the moment. Some of the most influential decisions we make in our lives come from moments in time we don't ever really recall. It's funny how I remember all the research I put into some random purchases, like when I buy a new mobile phone. That's a cell phone for my American friends. I will spend upwards of weeks researching the latest tech, taking time to read reviews and comments from past buyers, and seem to lose myself in the journey to eventual purchase. But when it came to deciding whether to check out the prison, I honestly cannot remember the advertisement that led me to the information night. I do remember needing to apply so I could receive a clearance for entry. Not everyone is given access to the prison. They require your details, and then run some detailed checks to ensure you don't pose any security risks. I do remember that it took just 2 days for me to be cleared. Something else I remember so vividly is the moment I came over the distant hill and saw the facility for the very first time. It's located in an industrial complex, and the road running in front of it can get quite busy at times. The late afternoon when I first turned up turned out to be one of those times when the road was almost deserted. As I came down the slight hill, my eyes pored over the place, taking in the dozens of high poles that stretched above the prison, each holding either a light or a security camera. The walls looked so different than I imagined, consisting of flat concrete blocks topped not by razor wire, as I had always assumed, but instead by an 8-foot diameter pipe, wide enough to ensure a person couldn't take hold and climb over. The car park was quite full as I turned in, and I could see the occasional officer heading back to their car. They looked serious, quiet, and no doubt tired after a long shift. Once I parked, I watched a couple and wondered what it would feel like to be wearing that uniform. And after a couple of minutes of just sitting there in silence with the car switched off, gazing out towards the walls, parked cars, and the officers walking to and fro, I asked myself what the hell I was doing there. How did I end up there at all? I remember that moment in time so vividly, so clear in my mind. How had I gone from simply seeing the advert a few days prior to sitting in the car park, or parking lot, of a maximum security facility and about to head inside? It was that very moment that will stick with me forever, because for me, it became the watershed moment. That single point in time is where it all came to a head. I hopped out of my car and stood beside it for at least 10 minutes, deciding whether I really wanted to go through with it. Questions kept popping into my head, but deep down, I already knew my decision. I had, after all, just driven almost 2 hours to get to the place. Once I was processed through in the reception area and walked to the other side of the walls, those same questions and doubt resurfaced, and a part of me wanted to turn back and run. I had entered a place which some of the most dangerous criminals in the country were calling home. I know I've mentioned this part before, but when I was sitting in that presentation and heard the first guy speak his opening line of, "It takes a very special kind of person to be a correctional officer," I really did want to call it quits. Do you know what finally convinced me to continue through with my eventual application? It was one part of the tour in particular. While the information given out during the talk was great, it wasn't until we walked into Marine North that things became real. Up until that moment, it had been nothing but officers talking about this and that, and we all simply sat and listened to their stories. But stepping into that unit and having actual prisoners rip into us from behind their cell doors, that made shit real. The screaming was relentless, with just a single officer standing in the officer station. That was the moment I realized, somehow foretelling my own future, that I would stand in that very station, perhaps even alone during a similar night shift. And, as you know, that's exactly what happened. Many times. I was numb driving home after that information night. Numb and displaying a weird kind of grin I couldn't seem to wipe from my face. It was as if I knew where my destiny lay, or at least the next few years of my life. The stories those officers had shared would be forgotten, replaced by my own within a very short amount of time. Stories that I have tried to share with you through these books. And now, after having shared those experiences throughout the past 11 offerings, it's time for one final go-around. One final journey behind the walls for you to see just what it's like. Or is it? Writing these books opened even more doors for me, and eventually led me down a different rabbit hole. Whilst the prison certainly gave me an insight into a place most of us would never ordinarily see, it also showed me what was possible if I sat down and committed to writing the stories that had filled my mind for previous years. I wanted to share those stories, but for a long time didn't think it was possible. That was until I began sharing these prison experiences. Perhaps once you finish these books, you would consider one of my fictional offerings. My Max series has been described as the perfect crossover, due to the very real feel of the story, based inside a fictional maximum security facility I created, one that is remarkably similar to the one I myself worked in. The feel of the story, the very emotional connections, are all so close to the real thing that, for many, makes it feel as if it's true. And you know what? Perhaps it is in some way, coming to me as I walk the endless corridors of this very real place. Wherever these books have taken you, I hope it is as far away from the possibility of you finding yourself in one. For me, this experience has been life-changing in every way. I've made some really close friendships, as well as met some people I would never have if I hadn't shared these stories, readers like yourself, spread across the world. I cherish each and every message and email I receive from you, and do my best to provide a sufficient reply to all of them. I guess, with all things said and done, it's time to don the uniform once more, grab our keys and radio, and head inside beyond the walls. Remember, this place bites, and those bites leave marks. Try and stay close, and let's make this one a trip to remember. Wednesday, May 1st. Took my chances with gaining an overtime shift to start the month off, and I won, scoring 12 hours in Yarra North. It's not the ideal way to spend a day of your life, but then again, there's always something to gain from working in this place. Not only is it one of the furthest places one can get from normality, but it's also guaranteed to keep boredom to a minimum. I bump into Khan as I come into the prison, joining the queue for processing right behind him. We catch up about life and family for a few minutes before I find out that he's also in Yarra North on an OT shift. It's a relief to hear, as there have been quite a few new officers getting around again. While new officers are always great to see due to their fresh energy, it's not always fun when it comes to the prisoners, who love nothing more than to take advantage wherever possible. It puts extra pressure on the other officers who have to spend half the day making sure no one is being led astray. As we finally reach the unit, a third officer is already sitting in the station, a young girl who introduces herself as Helen. Khan drops his gear under the desk while I stow mine in the unit staff room. We take care of the normal morning routine, checking the previous shift's notes in the unit log, as well as having a look at the unit muster. As I scan through the 60 or so names, my eyes immediately spot one that creeps me out instantly. A phantom smell suddenly invades my nostrils, one that I'm destined to remember for the rest of my days. There is nothing I can do to wipe the memory of Robert Coleman's shit smell from my mind, and seeing his name turns my stomach in a heartbeat. I look up, wave at Khan to get his attention, and show him the name. His grin comes on as fast as the phantom smell did for me. "Oh yeah," he grins. "Came in a couple of days ago." "What for?" I ask. "Medical appointment." He turns to Helen and gives her a quick rundown of Coleman, ensuring to mention his extensive medical conditions, including HIV. She listens with a look of concern, and I think it's a genuine reality check, despite spending weeks learning about the job from experienced officers who would have highlighted the diseases that live in this place. While we bring the new officer up to speed, a fourth shows up, this one allocated as our transporting officer. It's Chris Upton, a man whose voice you can hear from the adjoining unit. He's loud, over the top, and always looking to make people laugh around him. I've mentioned him in previous months, telling the most inappropriate jokes imaginable. He's in the unit less than a minute before he shares one with Helen. I do my best to leave the station and join Khan for the morning muster. While I carry the clipboard and ligature knife, Khan drops each trap, greets the crooks in the cells, and calls out numbers for me. Each cell is either a 1 or a 2, depending on the men inside. There's a single 3-outer upstairs, the only cell in the unit holding 3 crooks. The muster goes by without an issue, and once we return to the station, I call our number through to control. Helen is looking a little perplexed, doing her best to crack a smile as Chris continues with his stand-up routine. "Give the girl a break," I mumble, throwing an empty plastic cup at him. "You're going to scare her off." Helen tried to deflect a little. "He's all right." "Don't encourage him. You'll never shut him up again. Know what happens when you feed a seagull?" Chris looked hurt at that, although in a jovial kind of way. "Shut up, prick," he begged. "You'll hurt my feelings." He laughed as he spoke, ensuring at least someone laughed at his non-joke. It was another 10 minutes before Control finally made the morning call, announcing a wrong count. It's funny how experienced officers know where the issue lies before it's even discovered. It's not until later in the day that we find out morning patrol staff removed a crook to go to court without filling the unit login, and when the new day staff arrived into the unit, didn't conduct a proper count, simply using the previous night's number and conducting a basic welfare check of the cells. This time, I take Helen around for a second muster, giving her the clipboard while I check the traps. She struggles through the first few cells, but by the time we end up at the end of the line, she's mastering the pen and paper like the best. After phoning through our number, Control finally gives us the okay to unlock. I take the top tier, while Helen takes the bottom, unlocking each of the cells in turn before moving on to the next. Once I return to the station where Khan is already busy filling requests, I see the staring eyes from those exiting their cells, keen to get a look at the new officer. As we work our way through the morning, each of us shares a little about the duties with Helen, giving her a taste of everything. There are financial balances to check, request forms to hand out, cell allocation lists to update. There are 3 crooks leaving the unit that morning, all of them heading off to a country prison. There are another 4 due into the unit, which means rearranging cell allocations among the remaining population. As always, everyone's keen to see if a single cell, or a 1-outer, will open up. 2 of the departing crooks will vacate theirs, with new crooks needing to join the bottom of the list. With 2 single cells essentially becoming available, every man and his dog is snapping around the heels of officers, keen to see who the winners are. Despite having a list, there's always someone who ends up pissed off, positive that it should have been their name next in line. Thankfully, the presence of a new female officer seems to do the trick, with Khan reading out the names of the next 2 names on the list. Despite a mild groan of disappointment from the crowd, nobody jumps up and down like a spoilt brat. Chris heads out with his first escort just as the medical cart turns up. They meet at the airlock, with Chris waving the nurse and her escort through. Once they've crossed over, I make my way over to the trolley and wait for the nurse to set herself up in the dispensing room as I chat to the escorting officer. The line for the morning meds begins to form behind me, with almost the entire unit falling in. I nod to Khan, and although the majority of crooks already appear to be flocking to the line, he makes the announcement over the unit's public address system. Helen remains sitting behind him, wide-eyed, taking in everything around her. For a new officer, it's almost impossible to blend in with experienced officers. There are two distinct things that betray them every single time, and both are almost impossible to mask. Despite many trying to, they remain as visible as a lighthouse at night. The first is their uniform. Always a little too crisp, too fresh, too bright to be anything but brand new. What I always found strange was that even when an experienced officer wore a new set of uniforms, perhaps just after picking up their latest replacements, they still didn't appear as a fresh officer, remaining just as blended as the rest of us. They looked like brand new shiny cars during the first hours after rolling out of the showroom, while experienced officers look like weathered cars fresh from the detailer. Perhaps it's because of the second thing that new officers can never mask themselves, unable to run away from the reality of their freshness. It's their faces, their eyes, wide with amazement, fear, intrigue, curiosity, maybe even apprehension. It's the myriad of emotions hiding behind their eyes. Perhaps their eyes not big wide enough for them to see everything at once. As I waited for the nurse to get ready for the morning rush, I watched as Helen did her best to look in control, while appearing to be anything but. As she caught me watching her, I gestured for her to join me, and then explained the process of the morning medication. It has always been a great way to get amongst the crooks, removing the barrier the officer station provided. She looked genuinely scared as we stood there, keeping the crooks in line until it was their turn. A couple tried to push past, someone always wanting to test the boundaries like some 3-year-old, but we quickly put them back in line. Just as I thought we were going to have a nice, smooth run, the nightmare that was Robert Coleman turned up, joining the back of the line and peering around the crook in front of him every few seconds. He was checking out the fresh officer beside me, no doubt preparing for one of his famous greetings. He had an expression of deep intrigue, with a hint of a grin one immediately recognized as contempt. But as much as I was expecting him to start when he finally reached the front of the line, Coleman simply followed the procedure and received his medication. He had a bit of a laugh with the nurse, and that was it. I almost felt a little disappointed at the weak climax to the buildup. Once Khan made a second and final call for morning medication to the unit and nobody responded, Helen and I wished the medical trolley a great morning and returned to our previous position in the station. By 9 o'clock, all 3 of the outgoing prisoners are waiting for their escort out of the unit. I call Chris on the radio and find out his ETA, and he returns a few minutes later. It's almost like a full-on farewell parade as the rest of the unit come to see the 3 departing prisoners off. There are hugs, waves, and pats on the back. Several stand on either side of the door for a final send-off. Once they leave the unit, there's an almost lull that descends over the unit, as if the life itself had been sucked out of the place. I grab a seat and simply watch life continue as Khan checks his emails and Helen heads to the bathroom. While some of the crooks disappear back into their cells, a small handful head outside into the choke pen, while others perform the odd chores. It's not long before the phone rings, and when I answer, find Jeff from one of the dispensing rooms calling for the morning's methadones to be brought across. I hang up and call Chris on the radio again, and then inform him that I'll send the 24 crooks to the gate. It saves him from needing to walk all the way back to the unit, and because no prisoner ever wants to miss out on their methadone, are only too happy to make their way up. There's a brief period of lively excitement again as we herd the group out of the unit. followed by another moment of silence, with the remaining crooks quietly going about their business. Once I'm back in the station, I check the computer for that day's random searches and briefly scan over the first two, cells 8 and 41. But as my eyes drop down to the final one listed, my heart sinks when I see cell 22. In my haste to dismiss Coleman's chance to get under my skin, he's gone and landed on my face. My mind instantly returns to the time when I had the pleasure of looking after him in the medical wing, and the smell of his shit inundating the entire area as his fecal-laced water flooded the immediate area. But that wasn't my only experience with a prisoner. My mind also recalling a time I processed him into the prison, and the sex toys, stained underwear, and disgusting contents of his property tub. He was not what you'd call domesticated, more like someone living their days in some secluded cave. I peered over to his cell and saw the door slightly ajar, with Robert inside. To give Khan a chance to psych himself up for the search, I tap him on the shoulder and point to the screen. He takes a look, and I feel his shoulders slump as the cell number registers. His eyes looking up at me are enough to tell me his thoughts. My grin is enough to tell him mine. We decide to keep the cell searches until the afternoon, instead opting for the daily checks at that point, also called the tick and flicks. These require an officer to make the rounds of the unit, walking into each and every cell for the purpose of safety and security. The intercoms need to be checked for damage and given a run, with the button pressed and verbally tested. The rest of the cell is also required to be checked for damage and necessary maintenance. The windows need checking, as well as the facilities like the sink, shower, and toilet. Checking cells doesn't feel like much, but as you know, prison isn't the kind of place where you can afford to drop your guard. The tick and flicks need 2 officers to complete them safely, with one remaining down in the station to perform the actual tick and flicks, as well as answer the incoming calls through the intercom. That person also has another job, one far more important than any of the rest of the duties, and that is to maintain contact with the officer entering each cell. With the unit fairly quiet at that moment, I decide to take the checks, with Khan showing Helen how to fill out the tick and flick book, as well as answer the intercom. He explains the importance of maintaining good communication with me during the process, particularly with monitoring the durations while I'm inside cells. If I'm lost from view for too long while inside a cell, she needs to immediately investigate. Sadly, this is one of those situations where the line between prisoner and officer is often blurred, especially with newer officers. They tend to lose their focus and allow complacency to creep in, assuming they are just another person in the unit. They're definitely not, and one of the most dangerous moments in an officer's day is when they step out of the full view of cameras and other officers and into a cell. For all anybody knows, there could be half a dozen crooks sitting inside, just waiting for a complacent officer. It's happened in the past, and will definitely happen in the future. I start at the top and work my way backwards, namely because that's where most of the cells remain empty. The prisoners are still out of the unit, and this gives me the perfect opportunity to do a quick check. The first few cells turn up clear, with Helen answering the calls quickly and efficiently. I run my eyes over the necessary items, give the waterworks a once-over, and continue on. In cell 49, I find a crack in the toilet bowl, while cell 31 has a missing screw from the intercom grill. It's little things like that which we eventually report to the soup, who will organize for maintenance to fix them. When I reach cell 22, I poke my head inside the door and find Robert sitting on his bed with a towel wrapped around his head, as if drying his long locks. He doesn't have long locks, just a standard style of brown thinning hair. He looks up at me and immediately sports the same weird grin as before. "Press your button, please, Robert." He does so, and when Helen responds, He jumps in before I have a chance to answer. Yes, ma'am, the button is working fine. Could I trouble you for some painkillers for my glands? I look over at Helen and she shakes her head in confusion at me. Once we're finished, Robert, I offer, and he drops back onto the bed. The methadones return during the final few cells, and by the time I return to the station, the unit is once again abuzz with activity. There's nothing quite like some methadone to keep the party going. There's a brief fight moments later, with the shouting match starting in a downstairs cell. Several other crooks make their way to the open door, then stand back as the occupants continue to throw insults back and forth. From what we can make out, it appeared as if someone took a shit while the other occupant had been sleeping. Khan made his way up the stairs, and I followed close behind, leaving Helen to man the station in case things kicked off. They didn't, with the bark from the crooks much louder than the bite they could have delivered. Both were pushing the pension age, with one close to 70 years old. Neither would have had the stamina to climb the stairs in one go, and Khan and I simply stood in the door after asking the others to move along. The hardest part of settling the crooks down was the unimaginable stink of shit in the air, bad enough to bring a tear to my eye. I wondered whether it was worse than Coleman's experience, and quickly knew nothing could compare to that. To prevent a second flare-up, we coaxed the more mobile of the two away from the cell and asked him to spend some time down in the common area. This guarantees both parties enough time to cool their jets a little and saves us the hassle of breaking up another fight. It's not long before lunchtime muster comes around, and Helen puts her hand up to take the lead, grabbing the clipboard and walking the floor once the unit is ready. Khan and I take up spots in the middle of the unit and conduct our own private tally as we watch Helen do hers. The unit remains silent, not unusual considering the eyes watching the young woman as she circumnavigates the tiers. Once control call count correct shortly after us phoning in our numbers, the unit lines up for lunch, with the kitchen billets ready and waiting to serve up. It's another quiet moment of the day, with most soon too busy eating to talk. The silence is almost unnerving. We wait another hour before Khan and I grab our rubber gloves and head out to conduct our random cell searches, leaving Helen to man the fort. Chris informs us that the first of the transport buses has already landed, and it wouldn't be long before we receive our first new incoming of the day. We make our way to cell 8 and find its occupant, Donald Chase, sitting on his bunk reading. He's a quiet chap, maybe middle-aged, and not prone to making waves. Khan leads the strip search as I stand back and spot for him. Once finished, the crook exits the cell and we start searching. Donald doesn't strike me as someone prone to keeping weapons or hard drugs in his cell. He's a withdrawn kind of man, in for possession of child porn and more prone to walking away from conflict. Maybe it was the shyness that kept him mostly isolated. We don't find anything out of the ordinary, and once finished, head over to 41. The occupant of the cell is one of the crooks who left the prison that morning, giving us an empty cell to give a quick once-over. When we finish, both Khan and I look at each other, the unspoken words hanging in the air between us as we both prepare for what's to come. Cell 22's door was slightly ajar when we arrive, and just as we approach, Khan starts a rock, paper, scissors sequence. I join in, throw scissors up, and promptly lose the challenge as he holds up a fist. Prick, I whisper, and take the lead. Robert is still sitting on his bed with the towel wrapped around his head. He looks up startled as Khan and I enter. Random search, Robert. He momentarily remains where he is, then flies into a rage, jumps to his feet, and starts prancing from one side of the cell to the other, an entire 5 or so feet in distance. My lawyer will hear about this, he starts with his American accent. Just you wait and see. Going to sue you for harassment. Okay, Robert, but first we need to do a quick strip search. The words had barely left my mouth before he threw his arms into the air and cried for help. "Oh no, oh no, oh no, I won't be treated like this, not like this." He points his finger at me, as if somehow enunciating his words. The only thing I'm watching for is the telltale signs of him wanting to spit at us. The man is disease-riddled, and the last thing I want is a face full of spit from an HIV-infected man. He finally starts to settle, and before long begins to strip down until all that remains before us is a skeletal memory of a man. His legs look barely thick enough to support the rest of him, although I doubted the rest of him amounted to much. Most of his teeth were missing, and he kept staring at me with eyes that appeared far too sunken into his skull. If he didn't speak, he could have been the stuff of nightmares, but his soft, high-pitched voice highlighted the reality of the man and gave him a slight touch of humor. And as we watched him do the strip dance before us, the stink of his cell hung over us. Once Robert was dressed and out of the cell, Con and I went to work. Thankfully, his usual assortment of cups weren't on the window ledge. Robert has a taste for man-seed and likes keeping samples from each of his unit conquests in cups for later use. I'll let you decide what that means, but I guarantee that mouthwash isn't the correct terminology. Aside from the usual bunch of filthy socks, soiled underwear, and bits of food scraps, there wasn't much else to find. His cell held nothing anybody would consider useful, and it leaves me shaking my head at the thought of how some lives are simply wasted. Robert pushes past us as we open the cell door again, promising to contact his lawyer if anything was missing. Con simply shakes his head as we head back to the station where Helen is trying her hardest to keep the half a dozen crooks at bay, answering their requests for forms and account balances. Once they see us returning, the crowd disperses. After filling out the rest of the reports from the searches, there's not much else to share from the day. I find that although it was a great shift, it's not something I miss from my life. The thought of finding cups of sperm in Robert Coleman's cell or old guys fighting over the smell of shit doesn't hold the kind of appeal it once did. And as we walk out of the prison together at the end of our shift, I thank each of my coworkers and prepare for the nights ahead of me. Thursday, May 2nd. Initially rostered on a patrol shift, the soup called me early in the morning and asked whether I'd be interested to come in earlier to do a shift in reception. I didn't need to be asked twice. Coming in early also carried another benefit, one far more rewarding for me. It also meant going home early. The reception area was already mostly deserted as I entered, with just a single staff member remaining. His name was Tal, an officer who'd been in the job maybe a year. While I didn't know him personally, I did hear rumors about him and how he had been removed from all 3 of his previous postings. People believed him to be lazy and not a team player, to be too friendly with prisoners, and unable to confront them when needed. He also showed all the hallmarks of someone that would be taken advantage of by prisoners if they were given the opportunity. To be honest, he seemed fine as I sat and chatted to him for a while. We talked about the job in general and the units he'd been previously posted. He asked me about mine and my history. He seemed like an okay guy, and we chatted as several officers passed through. Just before the first lot of night shift officers came through, he showed me the mail that still needed sorting, as well as the list of newspapers that needed allocating once they arrived in the morning. There wasn't much to be shown, and once we began to process the latest arrivals, focused on the job at hand. It wasn't long before the reception area began to fill with the officers preparing to end their shift. Cameras in the reception area kept an eye on those hoping to escape early, but for the most part, the bulk of the officers did the right thing and simply waited for control to call count correct. As soon as the call came through, the wave of officers tsunamied their way through the front door, with a secondary wave coming through a few moments later. Tal didn't hesitate, giving me a quick wave before jumping ahead of the first wave, disappearing into the subsequent flood that burst through my neck of the woods. I stood by the single door that led from the inner reception area to the outer and checked each officer that passed me, ensuring none held prison keys in their possession. I was greeted around 100 times during the next 10 minutes and tried my best to reply to each. It was only once the flood began to recede that I finally relaxed again and grabbed a seat behind the counter and waited for the rest of the outgoing staff to clear up. A late arrival came through against the flow of traffic, and I processed him inside, running the metal detector over him as well as his belongings through the X-ray. One of the intelligence officers comes through a moment later, and I instantly take a disliking to what he's carrying in one hand. It's a large plastic bag, and when he sits it on top of the mail crate, too big to fit inside, I nearly cry. There must have been enough mail to fill a truck in that bag, and I knew most of my night had been sealed, handed a task that would take well into the next day to complete. After grabbing my bag of raw almonds, a bottle of water, and my reading glasses, I take a final look at the reception area to ensure it's clear, then grab the first handful of letters. It's the first of many more for the night. After the first dozen or so, I soon rediscover the reason I hate reading mail so much. It's the same boring stuff from one to the next. There are endless letters from wives and girlfriends talking about how sorry they are for cheating or for sending them back to prison for the IVO breach, intervention order. There's the usual letters from those saying how much they miss their partner, how they are the best thing to ever happen to them, and that once they get out, they should get married and move away for a fresh start. The letters that always sadden me are the ones from children, including photos, drawings, paintings, and other crafty things. There are normally handwritten notes accompanying the pictures, telling the recipient how much they miss them and how they hope they come home soon. It's not easy reading those, and it doesn't take long for my eyes to glaze over as I try to get through as many as possible. By 10 o'clock, I take a break and prepare for the shift changeover of the prison nursing staff. First, there are the 3 incoming nurses whom I process through. Then, about half an hour later, the outgoing nurses come through, and I wait for them to get to their cars before heading back inside and locking the doors for the night. Aside from a few moments away from the desk while I eat my dinner, there's not much else to share about a night reading letters. There is one letter that stands out, highlighting itself when I turn it over to open. It's the return address that jumps out at me. Why? Because the address is just a half dozen houses down from my own. It's a little too close for comfort. When I drive home the following morning, can't help but slow down as I pass it to try and get an eyeful of my newly recognized neighbor. Friday, May 3rd. It's a second night in reception for me, and Tal is once again sitting alone when I arrive. I find that he highlights one of the sad realities of prison. While he's a nice enough guy to chat to, he's been ostracized by his peers for the issues that none of them would have experienced firsthand. He would no doubt be the subject of gossip and rumor, given the cold shoulder by those working with him. I try to accept every person on face value, having personally suffered from bullying several times throughout my life. I grew up with an abusive father, listening to him slam anyone who wasn't like him. As I've said before, I hate bullies and will never follow their lead. Talking to Tal just highlighted the fact that he wasn't in the right job. He revealed his fear for the place and the way he couldn't relax when working around prisoners. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder and didn't know whether he would remain. My advice to him was to think about what he really wanted to do with his life. Prison wasn't a place to be sitting while deciding one's future, not when surrounded by an endless cycle of violence and abuse. By the time the final muster was called correct, Tal shook my hand, and I could tell the talk had done him wonders. As I watched him walk out, he had a kind of bounce in his step, one which appeared to show a man on a mission, one that would lead him to new and exciting adventures. For me, the night was a complete repeat from the previous, with the only difference being my dinner. Everything that I did was just a continuation from my previous shift. The mail was the same, with even some of the names exactly the same. I was happy to reach the end of the shift, a weekend away from the place ahead of me. Monday, May 6th. I came in for a patrol shift, one I had been looking forward to because Chris was also on. We had planned to team up, then spend the majority of the night playing cards. My hopes were dashed when I came through the control room airlock and found my name changed into Murray North. With a long sigh, I grabbed the keys for the unit, a spare battery, and made my way out towards the unit. Several officers greet me as they head the other way, all keen to get out of the place after a long shift. I only wish I was joining them. Once inside the unit, the usual greetings begin my shift, with several crooks burning someone in one of the bottom cells. After stowing my gear, I head to the officer station and check out the muster. There are no names that jump out, and I wait for one of the day staff to return to the station to fill me in on the new arrival. Ty Alderman is the first officer to drop by, and he fills me in on the day's highlights. There's a new crook who arrived just in the previous hour, and when he was led into the unit, ignored the questions fired at him by some of the other crooks. They didn't take too kindly to that, and when the kid flipped one of them the bird, all hell broke loose. The majority had spent the last hour burning the kid to a crisp. Being a new arrival into the unit also put the kid on a management watch, adding to the two already waiting for me. I took a glance over to the observation cells and saw that they were sitting empty. That was both positive and negative. It meant I had no S-watches to worry about, but it also meant I had 2 available cells if the soup needed to utilize them. I grab a seat and watch as the day shift officers finish off the final few chores before the end of their shift. One removes the last of the washing from a dryer, bags it up, and walks it to an upstairs cell. It means that as far as chores go, thankfully the washing won't feature among those I need to complete through the night. We share a bit of banter once the work is finished, and it's just a waiting game for control to call the final muster correct. Once the call is made, the rest of the gang disappear faster than the proverbial. They're gone before I have a chance to wave goodnight and find myself alone once more. Before I do anything else, I start by checking my emails. Mondays are always the best for checking out incident reports, as there's normally 3 or 4 days' worth attached. It makes for some interesting reading, and it's not long before I find myself lost in the world of assaults, unit ramps, codes, and other exciting events. Saturday looked the pick of the bunch, with 4 code alphas called in a matter of a couple of hours. Each one was a direct confrontation between officers and prisoners, with one officer sustaining injuries severe enough to warrant a visit to the hospital. There were also several weapons found during a unit ramp, plus several positive urine tests coming back. The unit continues its burning of the new arrival, and I start thinking it would make a great soundtrack for those looking for some inspiration when working out at the gym. Just listen to a bunch of guys screaming endless abuse for a few hours. It will surely help motivate you to a better workout. I continue reading, flicking through to the final page and find the results from the previous morning's ramp of this very unit. It's hard to believe, but even with the entire population locked down for 23 hours per day, there are still items that manage to find their way in. Several pills were discovered in a cell, with a few shivs also hidden around the place. One person had a complete cell phone setup, including phone and charger. I shut down the computer once I finish and instead opt for some television. I don't bother with the volume, as the crooks provide plenty. There's a documentary about a guy that hunts for ancient artifacts, kind of like a modern-day Indiana Jones. The show intrigues me, and when the first episode finishes and a second one begins, I'm in sheer indie heaven as he searches for the long-lost Ark of the Covenant. There's a buzz from one of the crooks around midnight, asking when the noise will subside, and as if hearing him, the last remaining burners give things a rest. They've had zero response from the new arrival, who managed to hide in his cell throughout the night. Little does he know that he won't be able to avoid confrontations forever. By 1 o'clock, the unit is silent, and I open the computer once more and begin short writing sprints in between doing my management watches. With the crooks asleep, it's a perfect time to get through some writing. The sleeping unit the perfect place to write uninterrupted. It's around 3 in the morning when a crook buzzes me up complaining of chest pains. He has no real history of trying to manipulate the system, and I call the code, effectively waking up more than a dozen people who were probably in the midst of fighting fatigue. I flick the lights on as the first of the officers arrive and point up to the far corner of the second tier. It's only when the soup turns up that I find out the crook who buzzed up had been trying to get out of the unit for almost a week, claiming he had been targeted by one of the gangs. It's not until the soup heads to the prisoner's cell that a couple of others begin calling for the dog to be put down. The prisoner in question, a guy named Marley Thompson, had been brought to the unit for his own protection after providing intel officers with information regarding drugs making their way into his previous unit. The other protection units had available cells, but intel regarded even a protection unit as being too dangerous for the crook. They expected a hit on him in any of the units, with the gang having a significant reach behind the walls. As far as anyone was concerned, the safest place to hold Marley was in a unit where the population was locked down and controlled. Once the medical staff arrived and assessed him, they deemed Marley as needing some more attention back in the medical wing. They called for a stretcher, and as he was walked down the stairs, the burning began. A relentless chorus calling for the rat to be fucked up, the dog to die, and the mutt to be handed over to them. It only ended once Marley disappeared through the airlock. As the attending officers also exited the unit and I killed the lights, the rest of the crooks returned to their previous state, leaving me in silence once again. That would have been perfect, with just a couple of hours to go before I would begin my morning breakfast duties. But any chance of having another couple of quiet hours all but disappeared when I heard a faint knock on the airlock door almost an hour later. Escorted by 2 patrol officers, and looking like he would gladly jump into a hole if it had opened before him at that moment, was the aforementioned Marley Thompson. He had been assessed by the nursing staff, given a complete ECG, and deemed fit to return to the unit. Whatever issues he thought he had, they weren't enough to keep him from coming back into hell. Despite trying their hardest to return the prisoner back to his cell in silence, one of the other prisoners quickly picked up on the sneaky return and raised the alarm. Within seconds of him setting foot in the unit, the previous chorus resumed, this time in full swing. If there's nothing else you pick up from this incident, remember this: someone is always watching. They burnt him like never before, calling for his blood to be spilled as the cries circumnavigated the unit like a Mexican wave. And all I could do was sit back and listen as they let fly. It wasn't the most exciting night to write about, but then again, a good night for me is a bad night for you. There's not much else to tell, other than saying that I started the breakfast rounds a little after 5, welcomed the first officer in just after 6, and headed home just after 7. Tuesday, May 7th. It was a return to Murray North for me, and as I walked along the path towards the unit that evening, could already hear the burning from a couple of 100 yards away. It would seem that the screaming I had left only hours before had continued for most of the day, and once I step into the unit, am greeted by a wall of abuse. Ty is sitting in the station, and one look from him is enough to tell me that it has been much of the same for his shift. I can barely hear him try to tell me about his day, and he eventually gives up as the screaming hits maximum volume. The noise isn't easy for me to handle, especially with my Meniere's disease. The shouts hurt my ears, and every time someone thumps their door, the banging plays havoc with me, almost inducing bouts of vertigo. There's not a lot I can do about it, and thus do my best to try and ignore it. The good news is that the washing has been finished, and there are no watches at all. The one new arrival from the previous day had been transferred out of the unit, leaving just one crook left for the unit to burn. The day crew told me that Marley Thompson tried everything to get a transfer out of the unit, but despite his efforts, nobody paid any attention and ended up leaving him be. There was plenty of attention being directed towards his cell, but from where I was standing, couldn't hear any response. We waited for control to call the final count correct, and once they did, the day crew slipped out into the night, leaving me alone with 60 screaming psychos for company. To tell you the truth, despite what it was doing to my head, I sat listening to the noise in silence. Even after all the years I had spent in the prison, sitting in that officer station still felt as surreal as the first night I had ever sat in the unit alone. Hearing the crooks burn one of their own sounded almost identical to the very night I came through during the information session, and that was when it happened. The phone rang, and when I answered it, found the soup advising me of a group of prison visitors coming through for an information night. The tour would stop briefly in the unit and then continue on to one of the others. It would seem that the experience had gone full circle for me. It was almost half an hour later before I heard a tap on the window, and when I turned, saw a group of wide-eyed civilians standing behind their tour guide. I buzzed them in, and the moment they stepped through the airlock, the crooks turned on them. The abuse went from calling for the blood of one of their own to shouting insults at a bunch of fresh-faced hopefuls, all wondering what weird world they had stepped into. The goofy grin most of the visitors wore was one I knew only too well, having worn the very same expression when I came through this unit myself. I could see the many emotions each person held, ranging from fear, surprise, and shock to outright trauma. I didn't doubt their fear. They needed to feel it, to know the truth behind that emotion. This was a very real place, holding some very real criminals, with very real rap sheets. As I sat quietly back and listened to the tour guide give his spiel, I gazed over the group of visitors numbering around 20, and wondered which of them would make it. There were young people and old ones, big and little, those who looked brave and those who appeared to already have soiled themselves. The truth is, you can't pick them, not the ones who'd make it in this place. I've seen some of the biggest guys spend a day here and fold, and then find the smallest woman stand up to a 6'6" monster. It never quite works out the way you expect it to, which is why I learned from the very early days not to judge anybody. The group is in the unit no more than 5 minutes, the crooks ensuring that any attempt at conversation is useless. After giving me a brief thank you, the group is led back out into the night, and once they close the airlock behind them, I kill the lights. The rest of the night plays out nice and easy, with the abuse dropping to silence by 10. I spend the majority of the night writing, putting notes together on one of many Sam Rader ideas I have. There's just one buzz up for the night, a crook asking whether his name is on the bus for the following day. I check, don't see it, and tell him as much. Not that I would have told him if I did see his name. There is one prisoner due for court, and I wake him around 5, hand him his breakfast a short time later, then fill out the log once he's let out by night patrol staff. The breakfast rounds are finished in record time, and I sit around for the last hour talking crap with the fresh crew. All up, it's a good night, and I walk out of the prison that morning with a certain spring in my step, one signifying a small break before my return. Thursday, May 9th. Despite not having my name down for an overtime gig, the soup gave me a call anyway, in the hope I could come in. The prison was suffering a severe shortage of staff, with more than 20 officers calling in sick. I'm not sure if there was anything exciting happening in another part of the city, but as long as they were offering an extra shift, I was happy to accept it. It was a shift in the visit center I managed to snag, although I was also offered a shift in Murray North, which I declined rather rapidly. It was bad enough working in the place during the night. The day would be downright unbearable. Besides, I enjoyed working in visits. There was something about the positive energy that surrounded the unit, with families brought together for some bonding time. To my surprise, there were already 3 officers sitting out the back when I arrived, which left me free to head to the front. To turn a good day into a great one, Chris Phillips had already snagged himself the transporting role, giving up one of the chairs in the station. Pamela Hinckley and Bruce Stein had assumed their positions already, and I took up a seat behind them, watching as they prepped for the day ahead. There was a visits list near one of the computer terminals, and when I checked it, found just over 80 prisoners booked in, split between morning and afternoon sessions. The first half of the day had been allocated to protection prisoners, while the afternoon was set up for mainstream. The protection session had 38 visits, with mainstreamers holding 45. The good thing about the afternoon was that it had an extra hour for us to process the crooks. Pamela greeted me in between phone calls, and I gave her a wave before firing up the computer terminal. There was enough time to check my emails, while Bruce prepared the rest of the station, ensuring tags and seating allocations were prepped and ready to go. It felt like the calm before the storm, and part of me pictured the hustle and bustle of the unit in the approaching hour. It was Pamela's job to run the show for the day, sitting at the head of the station and liaising between the reception area, the strip room, the units, and the center itself. When a visitor arrived at the prison and was processed inside, they would phone Pamela, who would then send Chris to head down to escort them up. She would then phone the unit to request the prisoner to be either sent up or escorted up, depending on which unit they came from. She would also assign one of the many tables to the prisoner's visitors, depending on how many people there were in the party. As each prisoner entered the front of the visits area, they would hand over their ID card to either Bruce or myself, and then be pointed in the direction of their visitors. Cameras that were set up around the place were watched by Bruce and I, with a bank of around 4 monitors for us to keep an eye on. The visits area has its own set of unique rules, which need to be adhered to. The unit is one of the leading entry points for contraband, and there are dozens of ways for people to smuggle gear inside. It's up to Bruce and I to make sure we try and stomp as much as we can. If we don't, then the visits area becomes a virtual superhighway for drugs, tobacco, alcohol, cell phones, and various other items. As the first lot of visitors come through, Bruce points them towards their table allocation, and they each split off towards their spot on the floor. This group comprises a family of 4, with 3 very young children, a father, a brother, a friend, and 3 female partners. It's not long before all 7 prisoners make their way in through a side door near the station. Each of the prisoners is dressed in overalls, with the zipper cabled tied behind them to prevent tampering. They're met with hugs, warm smiles, and the kind of greeting that temporarily masks the place they're standing in. Bruce watches the monitors as Pamela continues phone surfing between the reception area and the units. I sit up and watch the floor. This is where good eyes count, right here. If we miss anything, the floodgates will open. So many different ways exist for people to smuggle gear in that they have the upper hand in this situation. The morning continues with more visitors arriving after each trip Chris makes. The trickle of protection prisoners continues through, and I watch as rapists, pedophiles, and murderers are welcomed into the arms of their families. I can't imagine how painful and difficult it must be for the families and friends of the perpetrators to go through this process. It was all going so smooth and happy until we were approached by the mom of one of the children. While the prisoner dad remained seated at the table with the two older children, the mom came up cradling the youngest, the little boy maybe a year old, if that. "Can you please open the toilet so I can change his nappy?" It was a simple enough request, and if the question had been asked in any other part of the world, would have been granted in an instant. But this isn't just any part of the world. This is maximum security, and in this place, the normal rules don't apply. "Sure can," Bruce begins, "but we need to change the visit to a boxed one," he finished with a straight face. There was no malice in his tone at all, but the venom from the woman was instant. "What the fuck do you mean? He's done a shit. I can't keep him sitting in shit, can I?" The dad remained seated, but turned to see what was happening. While Bruce kept a straight face, the dad didn't, a wry smile staring back at us from across the room. The rest of the tables looked over as well, hoping to see some entertainment. "Ma'am, you don't need to swear at me. I'm more than happy to open the restroom, but the visit will be turned into a boxed one. Those are the rules." She barely heard his words, continuing to rant. "I don't give a fuck. What dickhead put those rules in place anyway? This kid needs his nappy changed. He hasn't seen his dad in weeks, and you cunt thinks it's okay to—" "There's no need for that language. Now, either settle down, or we cancel the visit right now and you will be escorted from the facility." This just seemed to fire her up even more, and she reached for a box of rubber gloves that were sitting on the edge of the counter, launching them into the station. "All right, your visit is over," Bruce said. He stood and came around the counter. Pamela called a code Alpha, and the dad rose to his feet, the grin never leaving his face. I thought the woman was going to throw the child at Bruce, but she simply got further into his face, screaming a string of obscenities as the child began to howl in her arms. The rest of the center fell silent as all eyes turned to the show the woman was putting on. Bruce went to the dad, whispered something at him, and he simply nodded, leaned down, and kissed his other two children. They too were crying, and I have to say, it was one of the saddest things I've seen to date. While a lot of prison staff try to keep themselves separated from prisoners as a whole, looking at them like the criminals they are, there's a certain sense of humanity one can never lose, and watching children crying for their father is one of them. As a couple of officers approached, the woman finally settles, perhaps realizing the consequences of her actions. She hugs the prisoner one final time, and he leans down and kisses his son before disappearing back through the side door. The woman turns, grabs the hand of her daughter, and walks for the exit door, dragging the child behind her as the third tries his best to keep up. Once they disappear out into the corridor, the low hum of voices resumes, and 5 minutes later, it's as if the incident never took place. There's a reason why the rule is in place, and while it may seem harsh, the reality is that babies of all ages are used by unscrupulous parents to smuggle contraband inside. Nappies, or diapers, are a great way to get stuff past the watchful eyes of security. No officer would ever ask for them to be removed from a child so they can be inspected, and that's why parents use them. It's a common rule, one highlighted by a number of notices that are taped onto walls and doors around the center. It reads, "If you need to use the bathroom for any reason, including nappy changing facilities, your visit will be turned into a boxed visit." Bruce hands the monitors to me for a brief moment so he can type up a quick report for the incident. 10 minutes later, and everything is back to normal, as if nothing ever happened. We conduct a quick muster at lunchtime, with just 4 prisoners left in the room. Then, Once we clear the center out completely, an hour later, welcome in the mainstreamers. There are no real incidents to speak of, with the afternoon a smooth sail all the way to the finish line. Saturday, May 11th. Back to good old night shift, and tonight I'm off to the psych unit for an evening with some of the more colorful inmates in the prison. Because of the lack of traffic on the road, I end up in the unit well ahead of schedule and get to spend almost half an hour with the day crew. This also gives me time to check out some of the unit's tenants, many of whom have a dark tale to tell. As the rest of the crew sit around and talk shit for the time being, my eyes wander across the unit as prisoners prepare for another night in their cells. They get busy with making themselves hot drinks, running a bag of popcorn through the microwave, or hurry between cells to pass on some final messages. One crook I spot sees me looking and offers me a wave. He's someone I know from back in admissions where he worked for some time during my own stint in there. He's a nice enough fellow, always offering to help others whenever he can. But the warm smile hides a pretty dark past, and he's not the kind of person I'd want to meet in a dark alley. He murdered his partner in front of their 4 children, all aged under 8 at the time. He stabbed her more than a dozen times in the face and chest. The horror those children must have witnessed is simply unfathomable. I nod my head at him, and he continues his conversation with another crook, that one responsible for the murder of his mother. When I heard his story from another officer, it shocked me, as it wasn't what I was expecting from a man who seemed so quiet and withdrawn, almost fearful of anyone around him. He walks with a sense of apprehension, and his eyes never stop moving, perhaps watching for an attack he expects to come at him. He killed his own mother just at the time when he was about to make it big as a sportsman. Instead of signing up for a massive contract and rolling in the millions he would have made, he murdered the woman that brought him into this world, cutting her body up into bits. Another prisoner walked past them, waving hi as he headed back to his own cell. That one was also in for murder. The victim, a friend he'd been hanging around with for the weekend. He shot him in the back with a bow and arrow, then tried to play it off as a hunting accident. These were the types of people I would be spending my night with, to watch them from behind their cell doors. I got to answer their calls for medication, and then accompany the nurse to dispense them. But while the stories were always intriguing to listen to, there was one side I could never get used to, regardless of the amount of shifts I held in this unit. It was the eyes, the dark and bottomless pits that stared back when they spoke to you. It was those vacant stares that gave me the creeps. For some people, those black, remorseless eyes were the last things they saw in this world, and the horror that must have gone through their minds is something hard to convey to another person. It's like staring into the face of death itself. With control calling for all movement to cease, the day staff call for the unit to lock down, then grab the muster sheet and start their rounds. The first conducts count, while the second follows close behind and locks the cells. I follow close behind, checking each door to make sure it's locked. This is not the place I want to be caught in if someone misses a door, and yes, it has happened before, although I doubt anybody would openly own up to the fact. It's not long before count is called correct, and I'm left alone with a unit that has gone from bustling to near silence in just minutes. The observation cells all sit empty, and the nurse is busy in his office behind the station. It is just me and around 40 sets of eyes that can watch me through the grate in the bottom of their cell doors if they wish. I take a moment to simply sit and listen as the unit goes about its normal evening sounds. Televisions turn on in several, with the faint sounds of shows creeping out to me. There's a song playing on a stereo from somewhere near the back, a flushing toilet from one closer. I'm sitting in a unit where the majority of inmates probably had their faces on the front page of newspapers at some point or another. Think about that for a bit. An entire unit where everybody had been on the front page of newspapers for their crime. After a few moments of silence, I head to the computer and check my emails, but after finding nothing of interest, set up my own television. I'm in between books right now, so there's nothing specific for me to write about, although there are several ideas twirling around my mind. There's a movie playing on one of the channels called American Beauty, a story about a man who becomes obsessed by his daughter's classmate. It's not my kind of movie, but with nothing much else to choose from, leave it on for background noise. As it plays out, I start to think back to my own story, the one playing out with my son and the things he endured. I'm almost floored by the similarities and end up switching the channel. Unfortunately, it was a little too close to home, and I try to turn my attention elsewhere. The intercom buzzes, and when I answer, listen as the prisoner asks for his nightly medication. Once again, the nurse is in the station before the words even float through the speaker. He mouths the name Thomas at me, and I give him a thumbs up, then cancel the call and wait for him to grab the pills. Within minutes, I'm standing at the cell trap and watch as the crook swallows his pills. The nurse wishes him a good night, and we head back to the station where we part ways again. It's all pretty routine stuff, and once the nurse swaps places with his replacement, exits the unit after another completed shift, leaving me with a fresh psych nurse for company. But not all nurses care for conversation, and the new one prefers the company of himself, only venturing out of his office once every hour or so to conduct his rounds. I end up spending a few hours just writing down random thoughts, with the rest of the unit silent for the remainder of the night. It's an easy shift for me, and as I know I'm returning for another shift in here tonight, hope for one just as forgiving. One can only hope. Sunday, May 12th. The same day crew that met me the previous evening are again sitting around and waiting for the clock to wind down on another shift for them. They're having a conversation about some incident that happened earlier in the day, a code in Yarra South. They offer me a wave and continue talking, and as I grab a seat, listen in. It's about a code alpha involving an officer that isn't seen as one of the popular ones in the facility. Like Tony Malone, Spencer Dobson is abrasive when it comes to workplace relations. He speaks to prisoners as if he's far superior to them, often dismissing their request with a shrug of the shoulders. He had been working in Yarra South for the day, and one prisoner in particular had been asking for him to see if he could place a late canteen form in. Canteen forms generally have a cutoff on the Thursday, except for late arrivals. These could be sent through manually by an officer. The crook arrived into the unit as a weekend transfer the previous day and had been asking for Dobson to put through his form. After seeing his request form still sitting on the counter where he'd placed it the previous day, said crook had had enough and decided to deal with the situation the only way he knew how. After returning to his cell for an hour or so, the prisoner came back one final time and asked Dobson in the nicest tone possible. The officer had been given every opportunity to do the right thing, but as described by his fellow officers, did everything he could to inflame the situation. The thing is, Dobson had told his fellow officers that the prick had been under his care in another unit years before and had always been a pain in the arse. When the other officers offered to process the form, he said no. He would do it when he could be bothered. It's not a good sign for another officer to go against what the first one said, and so the others stood back and let Dobson run with it. Have you ever grabbed an empty drink carton, dropped it to the ground, and jumped on it? The resulting pop can be quite satisfying, and I remember popping more than my fair share of cartons. Well, it turns out that prisoners also appreciate the pop a burst milk carton makes, especially when it's filled with a mixture of piss and shit. They say Dobson barely had a chance to react. He was sitting in a seat right behind the counter, his face almost at eye level. As quick as a flash, the prisoner pulled out a milk carton from behind his back, sat it lying down on the counter with the top of it facing the surprised officer, then slammed one fist onto the carton. The spray of bodily fluids hit the bewildered officer directly in the face, with some suggesting a tiny amount made it past his lips. The other prisoners in the unit had known of the impending spectacle ahead of time, and had apparently prepared for the show by finding sufficient vantage points. The unit erupted into a chorus of cheers and heckles, with Dobson momentarily stunned by the attack. Once he found himself again, he jumped up and raced for the staff toilet, gagging, disappearing inside for at least 10 minutes. One of the other officers called the code, remaining as far from the mess as possible, with the smell dictating the distance needed. As I listened to the staff repeat the story, I couldn't help but wonder just how many were happy to see Dobson getting his just desserts. He's the kind of officer that creates a lot of spot fires wherever he goes, leaving them in his wake for others to put out. There wouldn't have been too many officers sorry for what happened to him. It's not long before control calls count correct, and the excited voices soon trail off into the sunset, leaving me behind to man the post and keep the nightmares safe for the night. It's an almost exact repeat from the previous evening, right down to the call for medication and the nurse's eventual changeover. I spend the night mostly writing after coming across an idea that excited me. There are a few minor interruptions, including 2 nightly medications and a third who needed to just chat to the nurse about his voices. The morning can't come fast enough, and when the sun finally begins to make an appearance, it's all systems go to the finish line. Thankfully, I have a small break ahead of me, and I don't intend to take on any other shifts if offered them. Thursday, May 16th. Was due to come in for the first of 2 patrol shifts, but instead find myself again changed into Murray North. Being the worst shithole in the prison, it's not something I am especially happy about, but I play it down when handed the keys and radio by control. There's always someone watching, and if you make it too obvious about what areas you like and dislike, there are those that love giving you exactly what you don't want. Thankfully, the unit is fairly somber when I first walk through the airlock, with most of the officers sitting in the station and relaxing. 2 crooks are holding a back and forth somewhere on the top tier, while the soup is standing at one counter filling in an S-Watch logbook. Once I drop my bag, I head into the station and join the crew, spotting 3 watch logs on the counter. 2 are S3 watches, while the third is just a management log. The crew are talking about nothing specifically, and my arrival reminds several of them that the end of shift is fast approaching. They jump up and finish off last-minute chores, including handing out some final requests for the crooks. It's not long before I find myself alone once again, with control calling count correct after the first attempt. I watch as the day crew disappear through the airlock, then turn back to face the empty unit before me. It's a nice change to listen to the silence, with the prisoners keeping mostly to themselves. I know from experience that it's something that can change in an instant, and try to make the most of it. I spend the first few moments reading the logs of the 3 watches, 2 of whom were new into the unit. Just like most of the past S watches I've monitored, these have tried to manipulate the system and ended up in a worse unit than where they were originally destined. The good thing for me is that they have their own cells in this unit, and that offered them enough privacy to keep them happy. As I start my first round of checks, I lift each trap and peer inside. Only one of them looks up, gives me the finger, and returns to his previous television show. It's perfect, giving me the one thing I need to continue. The funny thing is, they think that by calling out some insult or flashing me the bird, they're somehow making my job harder. I hope they never find out that it actually makes our life easier. All I need is a sign of life, and I'm good to go. Once back in the station, I began to write down bits of ideas that have been flooding my brain ever since a new book came into mind. Sitting in the silence of the unit is almost perfect, with the story based inside a maximum security facility. It's kind of like Stephen King setting up his desk in the middle of a graveyard at midnight and using the setting for inspiration. The intercom breaks my concentration, and it's a call asking whether the crook's name is on the next day's court list. I check, and it's not. I find it so strange that some prisoners I've come across don't want to attend their own court case, doing their best to avoid fronting the judge. Yes, you read that right. He wasn't asking because he wanted to go. He wanted to avoid going, and if I had said he was on the list, probably would have tried to fake an ailment. Maybe I'm missing something, but wouldn't you want to get an answer? Think about it. If you aren't guilty, simply an innocent person, perhaps in the wrong place at the wrong time and caught up in the middle of something, wouldn't you do everything you could to get out again? And if you were guilty, wouldn't you want to find out the sentence the judge hands you so that at the very least you have an end date? It's something that has boggled me for years. But then again, a lot of the things that go on in here boggle my mind, not just whether a crook tries to avoid court. It's a curious world behind the walls, and maybe, someday, I will have an explanation. There's another buzz-up just after midnight, with a crook asking for painkillers. I asked him for what, and he said he had been bitten by a spider the previous day. I take a walk up to his cell for a better look, and when I open the flap covering his trap window, I'm surprised he waited so long. His knee looked humongous, swollen to such an extent that the poor guy couldn't bend it. He sat on his bed and pointed at it, and when he gave it a squeeze, I could see pus shooting from a point near the middle of the bright red spot. I called the code Mike, opened the trap, and asked him to sit tight. It didn't take long for the night crew to show up, followed closely by the nurses. They hid straight upstairs, and once the officers popped the cell door, walked inside to check his wound. To no one's surprise, the nurses called for the prisoner to be transferred to the medical wing, and 2 officers help him down the stairs and onto the stretcher. Seeing the wound up close didn't change the look of the pus-filled knee. It was huge, shiny, and burning bright red, and it didn't take a medical genius to see that the infection could be lethal. As soon as the team left the unit, I knew that the chances of the crook returning that night were pretty slim, and I head back to the station to type up the brief report. It was almost an hour later when I heard radio traffic talking about an ambulance needing an escort from the front gate and figured it was there for one person. Once I typed up the report and sent it through to the soup, I returned to my previous activity, continuing to make brief notes here and there. It was a quiet night, and in this unit, you took advantage of it when you could. There was just a single crook heading to court, and I woke him via the intercom just before 5. Once I began the morning toasting regime, I walked a few slices up to him just before the patrol staff came to collect him. The rest of the unit received their breakfast after the court had left. It was a good shift, despite my initial apprehension at the reassignment. It's not often I get to say that about the unit, but for once, I actually feel like thanking the crooks for a good night. It's a temptation I resist long enough to exit the unit and head home. Hopefully, I have another good shift tonight. Friday, May 17th. Despite getting ready and driving halfway to the prison, vertigo hits me hard along the way, and I end up pulling over to the side of the road. I'm not sure whether this type of vertigo has ever struck you, But what I can tell you is that when it hits, driving is virtually impossible. My vision is practically gone, with nothing but a spinning mess visible. I need to hold the steering wheel tight to stop myself from falling over in my seat. It's not something I was ever prepared for, and I question whether I can even drive home. I call through to the soup and tell him I need to go sick by 1. He doesn't sound happy, especially with just a short half an hour before the start of my shift. It's not how I normally play the game, but unfortunately, am not prepared to take the risk, with either driving to the prison or spending the night escorting prisoners around. Meniere's disease sucks. It really does. If you or someone you know has it, I'd love to hear. I'm still trying to get my head around it and how I can continue on with the various effects it has on my life. The ringing in the ear I can handle, somehow just becoming a normal part of my life. But it's the rest that gets to me, the vertigo, the deafness in one ear. I end up turning around almost an hour later after the vertigo disappears and carefully make my way back home. I'm nervous driving, but end up making it back in one piece. I spend the night in bed trying to settle myself and enjoy a few days off before my next shift. Hopefully, it's enough for it to completely disappear for a bit. Tuesday, May 21st. After a good break, I return for a patrol shift. As soon as I enter the admissions area, Eugene calls for me and asks whether I could process a late arrival into the prison. It's a late transfer, coming across due to an incident at another prison where an attack was carried out on a crook. I agree, then fill out my name for the usual protection units. Chris Upton already had his name down for them, and I dropped mine next to his, happy to work with the big guy. Tony Malone is also working, and I'm glad to see his name further down the list, as far from mine as possible. Chris is sitting outside of the staff room, and once I drop my gear off, join him for a brief moment of peace and quiet. I half expect a code to be called as I pull the chair out, but thankfully there isn't. We catch up on all things family and general life stuff, Chris telling me about the latest problems he's having with his wife. I listen to him share the story behind it, aware that the couple have had their fair share of differences in recent months. I have also been listening to Chris telling me how much he just needs a quickie because his wife won't put out. There's a bit of banter between us, but it quickly dies down when we see Tony heading inside the staff room. He's a definite mood killer, and we wait until he's disappeared from view before continuing. "Did you grab the meds sheet?" I ask. The meds sheet is a list of any after-hours escorts that need to be completed once count is called correct. He nods, reaches in, and unfolds it. "Just the one for us. Feldman, Yara South." The name instantly rings a bell. Feldman. Isn't that the young kid that killed his girlfriend? Chris looks at me blank-faced. "Feldman," I repeat. "Young kid. Looks about 15. We hung shit on him when he came through admissions one time." Despite looking as if he recognized who I meant, I knew he didn't. "You have no fucking clue," I joked, and he just laughed. As we continue waiting, another officer walks past, with Lackey Hunter looking mighty happy to be nearing the end of his shift. He grabs a seat, gives Chris a bit of stick, then leans in close. "You boys hear about Derek?" There are 2 Dereks in the prison, and strangely, I know the one he's talking about instantly. There's just something about Derek Frazier that puts his name higher on the list of when things go wrong. We both listen as Lackey starts sharing the story. Frazier had been working as part of a 3-person crew in Glen Elg West. He's the type of officer that is seen as fair by most, but every now and then can become a little too controlling, perhaps even seen as over the top. It turned out that he'd crossed too many crooks, and they decided it was payback time. The 3 officers working the unit were all regulars, with one just a few months on the floor. Fraser took the lead in the unit, and when one of the crooks came to ask for a replacement television because his wasn't working, Fraser turned him down. The crook became abusive, threw some insults at the officer, then headed back upstairs to his cell. Fraser called for him to return, and when the crook refused, followed him up the stairs. One of the other officers was in the unit staff room eating his lunch, while the second officer was in the storeroom, grabbing some bed packs for new arrivals due later in the day. That left Fraser to man the station. When he left to follow the crook back to his cell, he broke a number of rules and highlighted the old enemy every officer needed to remember: complacency. They say Fraser never slowed, simply following the crook back to his cell and walking straight inside. Little did he know that there were 3 prisoners waiting for him, and before he had a chance to retreat, a 4th closed the cell door and locked his foot into place from the outside, effectively shutting the officer inside. Fraser had time to press the emergency button on his radio before the crooks began to rain punches on him, and when his screams rang out from the cell, brought the other 2 officers back into the common area. For a full minute and a half, crooks kept the unit staff at bay, while those inside the cell dished out a whooping that the officer would never forget. They beat the living shit out of him, handing out a broken nose and jaw, a cracked rib, broken cheekbone, and severe concussion. Footage showed the crooks exiting the cell once reinforcements arrived, with all 3 simply kneeling on the floor and waiting for the officers to come and cuff them. Fraser was taken to the nearest hospital, where he remained while Lackey shared the incident with us. It was a significant attack and just highlighted the dangers we faced each and every day. Complacency is such an easy thing to fall into. I'm not trying to make excuses for him, but when you sit in a unit hour after hour with very little change, it can quickly become very boring. 12 hours is a long time to be bored, especially when doing the same thing for years on end. Complacency. It truly is one of the worst enemies of any correctional officer. Others might see it differently, but for me, it is the one thing that will rob an officer of situational awareness the fastest. Control calls count correct just as Lackey finishes his story, and he jumps up immediately, slaps Chris on the back, and heads for the gate. We decide to head off to Yara South first and check out our medical escort. May as well get him done first. We reach the unit and I fill in the logbook as Chris heads upstairs and grabs the kid. For some reason, I assumed he'd been in mainstream, positive that he had been given one of the fairly rough units. But whatever he started as, he was now in protection, and when I see him for the first time, I'm not surprised. The last time I saw this kid, he had shaved his head and tried his hardest to look older than what he really was. But time had certainly given him a new outlook on life, because the kid I saw coming down the stairs was definitely not the one I had processed that day way back when he first arrived. His locks had grown back, his hair straight and combed in a 60s slick back. His track pants were folded up above the knees, while his t-shirt was folded up and tucked under to appear as a crop top of some kind. If he didn't have gay tendencies when he first came into prison, he did now, and from the looks of it, was using his looks to his advantage. Chris and I escorted him down to the medical wing, the kid walking in silence a little ahead of us. Always the joker, Chris asked him a couple of questions, but as they were a bit on the smart-arse side, the kid ignored him. It was a simple escort, Feldman in and out in under a minute. He simply fronted the dispensing window, flashed his ID card, and swallowed the pills the nurse handed him under the isolation window. Once Chris checked his mouth, we turned and headed back to the unit. Halfway back to the unit, Control called for me, and once back in Yara South, I phoned them up once the kid was back in his cell. It turned out that the late bus had arrived early, and I didn't need to worry about processing the new arrival. That suited me fine, and once I hung up and filled out the logbook, Chris and I started our searching of the unit. While the first two units didn't yield anything of interest, I found a shiv in Loddon North. It was hidden inside a full milk carton, the bare shiv simply submerged in the liquid. Finding it wasn't really anything surprising. I simply pinched the top flaps closed to stop any milk from squirting out, then gave the carton a decent shake. I could feel the weapon inside quite easily. But what did surprise me was the viciousness of the shiv. Most metal shivs tend to have pointy ends, with straight edges that may have been sharpened by rubbing repeatedly over concrete. This shiv looked to have been folded specifically to hold small prongs on either side of the tip, maybe half an inch down. Think of a harpoon and you'd be close. If this thing was stabbed into someone, it would cause more damage being ripped out than when it was first stabbed inside. After finishing the last of our units, Chris headed back to the staff room, while I went back to admissions and typed up the report for the shiv, bagged it, and entered it into the intelligence log. Once I had it filed, I joined Chris and the rest of the gang in the staff room and kicked back for the rest of the night. Thankfully, there were no codes, and the rest of the night went by without incident. The morning court run was easy, with just 8 crooks heading out. Chris and I had none to pick up, and we simply helped out in admissions to process the ones as they arrived. Overall, it was a fairly good shift, and I look forward to another patrol shift that night. Chris said he would be back as well, and with hope, we would be teamed up to do it all again. Wednesday, May 22nd. It was Eugene running the shift again, and thankfully Chris had written my name next to his on the patrol roster as I was running a little late. Count had been called correct just as I slipped through the inner door that led into the prison, a long line of maybe 30 to 40 officers already waiting to make a quick exit. If I had been just a minute later, I would have had a tsunami of exiting officers to contend with. Imagine swimming against a raging current, and you get the idea. I catch up with Chris in the staff room, and once I drop my dinner into the fridge, we head straight out. Just like the previous night, we have Noah Feldman to escort up for his meds, as well as a new prisoner named Lee Lim. The latter prisoner was housed in Loddon North and was reliant on a wheelchair due to him only having one leg. He had lost the other through a motorcycle accident, which also left him alone, angry, and withdrawn. We elect to take the wheelchair crook first, and once we enter the unit, go looking for where the carer's name is. Wheelchair-bound crooks normally have a carer who is responsible for pushing them to wherever they need to go. After having no success with finding a name, we head to Lim's cell and ask him instead. He mumbles something about not needing a fucking carer and wheels past us as if on a mission to show us how mobile he is. Chris looks at me, raises his eyebrows, and I give him a nod. We are the last people he needs to impress. The quicker he can get himself down to the medical wing, the quicker we can get on with our night. Lim is surprisingly agile on his wheels, and Chris and I walk at a pretty brisk pace to try and keep up with him. By the time he reaches the compound's outer gate, we're still half a compound behind him. There isn't a single word spoken once we reach the dispensing window. Lim simply flashes his ID, receives his pills, and turns his mouth to us once he's swallowed them. He turns back just as hastily for the door, and once we open it, shoots through. It's a nice, simple run back to the unit, and once he's locked up again, we return for Feldman. He's just as feminine as he was the previous night, adding an extra swagger into his walk. Chris watches him wide-eyed as we head for the gate, always trying to get a laugh out of anyone watching. Now, don't take my word for it, as I'm not a trained psychologist, but I'm sure I heard somewhere that people who are always trying to make others laugh hold a lot of emotional sadness inside, hence why they always try to create laughter wherever they go. I think Robin Williams had something similar. I hope this isn't true for my friend, although I do know he's had some serious struggles at home. It's just another simple in and out at the medical wing, and before long, we return Feldman back into his cell. I head back to the unit log, fill in the details, then follow Chris's lead and commence our nightly searches. There's a code called halfway through our second unit, and we make our way over to Murray South. It's a medical code, the crook begging for painkillers due to a toothache. When I stand near the trap waiting for the nursing staff to show up, the prisoner flashes me his open mouth, and all I see are black stumps, with not a single white tooth visible. There's a juicy abscess on one gum, and I shudder at the thought of how much pain it's creating. The nurse is kind enough to hand him a couple of painkillers and promises to make an appointment for him with the dentist as soon as possible. It's a small gesture in such a moment, and the crook thanks the nurse before returning to his bed. We drop the trap and return to our previous search, end up empty-handed an hour later, and return to the staff room. Most of the couches already contain a heap of weary bodies, and after 5 minutes of watching some weird movie someone insisted on playing, Chris gestures towards the door as he holds up a deck of cards. I follow him out into admissions and we grab a seat in their kitchen. A couple of hands of euchre later, 2 more officers show up, and we end up playing doubles until it's time for us to head out for our early morning courts. It's another good night, and playing cards for most of it reminded me that the job held a lot more than just crooks and incidents. Worthwhile friendships are also created during downtimes, and although I may have come out of that night the loser, I felt like a winner when I walked out of the prison in the morning. Sunday, May 26th. After a couple of days off, I returned for a shift in Murray South. It's not quite as bad as Murray North, but it still holds its fair share of incidents. Out of all the management units, this is the one I'd probably choose more often than not, being set up as a normal unit. Whilst there's a central station like Murray North, the night shift officer isn't required to sit in it all night. Instead, there's the supervisor's office directly behind the station, and that's where we spend the majority of the shift. The office holds a television, computer, bathroom, and drink fountain, almost like a small, self-sufficient bungalow. I've spent many nights in this unit, some of which where I never left the office throughout the night, only popping out once breakfast needed to be made. The day crew were finishing off the final few chores as I entered, with 2 of them running along the top tier and conducting lockdown count. There was still 1 crook out mopping the floor, while the 3rd officer was in the station talking to someone over the intercom. I dumped my gear in the office and came back out for the final few minutes of their shift. There wasn't anything really to share, so we just talked shit mostly. I watched the 2 continue count as the intercom buzzed again, the same crook asking the same question, hoping for a different answer. He was wanting to know whether he could get a transfer out of the prison and into a different one, and I looked at the officer wide-eyed. He just laughed, told the crook to ask the soup in the morning, and killed the connection. "Just wants a transfer, huh?" I mocked. "Sure does. His mate got shifted today, and he needs him for moral support." The reality of our world right there. Moral support. Damn, prisons are just too hard these days. It almost makes the entire judicial system a mockery, because the sad reality is, the crook will probably get his way. There's a brief lull after the final head count is called through to control, and once they call count correct, I'm bid farewell for the night. I watch as the crew depart through the far door, then return to the office to see what the night will bring. I set the radio on the desk next to the computer monitor, and less than 5 minutes after calling count correct, Control call a code mic in Murray North. Not 2 minutes later, they call a second code mic in Yarra North. I can only imagine the patrol staff's frustrations. The two soups exchanged their intended locations via the radio, with the duty soup taking the first code and the backup soup taking Yara North. The patrol staff will also split between the codes. There's not much I can do from where I am, so continue on with my previous plan, which is to fire up the TV, check my emails, and then get writing. As I close the emails down and bring up a fresh word page, I hear the radio traffic pick up. From the sounds of it, an ambulance has been called, with the crook in Yara North needing urgent medical attention. It's almost another hour before I'm interrupted by the intercom in my unit. I head out to the station and find it's the same guy who asked for the transfer earlier. I hit the button and ask him what's up. "Boss, any chance for a feed?" I nearly choke on the piece of licorice I'm chewing. "Say that again?" I asked, as if confirming the idiotic question. I asked if there was any food left over from dinner. "No," I replied, instantly ending the call with a push of the button. I got barely 3 feet from the station when the intercom buzzed again. I turned and saw the same cell number flashing on the display window. I smiled to myself, unsure of what to expect. "Yes?" I asked. "Now, come on, boss. You know there's got to be something left over." I gave him credit for trying. "Nope, I just finished the last of it." He laughed at that and fell silent. I canceled the call and returned to the office. I think I wrote about a line before the intercom went off again. I slowly made my way back to the station and found the same cell number blinking at me. Of course it was. How dare I hope for a half-normal night? When I pressed the answer button and asked how I could help him, Scott Murdoch began to sing. As I listened to his words, I couldn't help but laugh. He had a sense of humor, and I actually wished I could have given him something, even if it was just a piece of licorice. But I couldn't, not with the cameras watching. Once he finished singing, I hit the talk button. "I like your effort, but serenading me ain't gonna help. You could try one of the talent shows, though," I offered, and he laughed again. Thankfully, this time when I ended the call, he let me be. His joke was funny, but I think even he knew that if pushed, it would quickly turn not funny, and I doubt he really wanted that. There was another code called just after midnight. This one another medical emergency of some kind. That's the problem with being stuck in a unit. Information wasn't readily available, and the funny thing is, you don't really care. Being in a unit protected you from the rest of the bullshit and gave you a break, even if it was only temporary. The rest of the night went by without incident, both for me and the rest of the prison. By morning, I had just one prisoner to wake for court, and I handed him some breakfast before his escort arrived. The rest of the unit were served a short time later, and thankfully, the day crew showed up a little early. It was a good night, briefly made a little brighter with a serenade from some faceless stranger with a sense of humor. It certainly beats someone's abuse. Friday, May 31st. When I initially arrived back in the prison, I was supposed to be on a patrol shift. But as some will know, I'm a pretty easy pushover for most things, and when someone begged me to take their place in Murray North because they really didn't want to work in the unit, I swapped. After giving Claire a call in the soup's office, she okayed the swap and I grabbed the keys and a spare battery. As I neared the unit a few minutes later, I questioned whether I had made the right decision. The burning could be heard from the other side of the compound, and when I walked through the airlock, wondered if someone had recorded a previous burning session and was now playing that recording through the speakers at maximum volume. It was loud. Once I entered the station, Khan tried to explain the situation to me, but as much as I tried to listen, couldn't understand a word he was saying. In the end, he simply pointed out a name on the muster sheet, mouthed the words, "kitty porn," and left it at that. When it came to those two words, what else was needed to be said? A new prisoner had been brought into the unit and had been responsible for not just the distribution of child porn, but also the creation of it. I've seen child porn creators in the unit before, but I'm not sure any of them had been responsible for porn involving children as young as 4 years old. The unit was doing its best to welcome the new arrival into the joint, and I can promise you that, if given the chance, they would have murdered the prisoner in a heartbeat. The new arrival was also on a management regime, which meant I had the pleasure of checking on him each and every hour of my shift. I won't lie, I almost considered phoning Claire back and asking for the swap to be returned to normal. But a promise is a promise, and as such, I remained in the unit. The noise was absolutely belting me, the ringing in my ear amplified by the thumping. I ended up looking for earbuds in one of the drawers, and when I found a spare set, used them. The rest of the day crew just laughed at me, thinking I was trying to be funny. Little did they know of my condition, and I wasn't about to tell them. I was almost thankful once the count was called correct and the day shift left the unit. It meant I didn't have to pretend to be unaffected by the noise. I'm not sure whether this makes sense, but whenever someone smashes their door, the boom physically hurts my ears, somehow rattling my brain. They were screaming for blood, calling for the rat to show his face so they could cut it off. The occupant of cell 11 was a marked man, and none of the crooks in this part of the unit would forget his face. Wherever he went, he would be forever targeted, and if they ever got their hands on him, the beating would most likely be close to fatal. There were still a couple of loads of washing in the dryers, and as I waited for them to finish, checked through my emails. There were several daily incident reports for me to read through, and as I opened each of them up, remembered the codes from the previous shift I had in Murray South. It turned out that the ambulance that had been called for the Yarra North code was for an old crook aged in his early 80s. He had been taken to the nearest hospital and passed away from natural causes just after 3 the next morning. As I read the notes about the incident, I recalled a very brief conversation I had had with a crook several months before while watching him during a brief stretch in the medical wing. What that man had told me struck me as odd at the time, but also made sense. He described it as a sad reality of the current times we lived in. He said that the cost of living had gone up to such an extent that many of the elderly citizens he knew could no longer afford to survive. Some people had discovered that it was actually much more affordable to come to prison to live out their final years, reducing the strain on their families that were often forced to pay for their expenses. In prison, medical care was free, just as rent and meals and entertainment were all included. As long as you didn't mind the strict bedtimes, he said, it was a great way to live relatively free from the burden of everyday life. Imagine a world where it was considered better to come to jail than spend your twilight years surrounded by family. I don't mean to sound like I'm preaching, but a future like that scares me. It really does. As I read that prisoner's death notice, I wondered just how many of them were within these walls because they could no longer afford to live as free men. If they really were, just where had things gone so wrong for them? I was interrupted by one of the dryers buzzing at me, and as I stepped from the station, the second dryer finished its cycle. Once I bagged the clothes into the cell bags, I walked them to their owners, passed them through the traps, and returned to the station as the abuse rained down around me. It was one of the few times where I wish I could have joined in. There were a couple of codes called, but I barely heard them. The noise just too great in the unit. The television was useless, and so I tried my best to get some writing done. But while the earbuds did block out some of the noise, they were nowhere near strong enough to block the noise out entirely, and trying to write was virtually impossible. So I simply sat and listened to the abuse with the television on for something to look at. The volume was turned down all the way, and I just watched a football game play out, minus the commentary. The shouts of abuse continued on, and at one point in the night, I began to get buzzed up by inexperienced crooks who asked how long the shouting would continue. It was just after 2 in the morning when the last of them finally quit, calling it a night and packing in. And when I went to check on the abused prisoner, found him lying on his back in his bed, simply staring up at the ceiling. There was no response from him as I raised the trap cover and peered in through the window. He simply stared straight up, occasionally blinking. By 3 o'clock, he had rolled over and was asleep. I could see the blanket lift and fall with each breath, the television playing some old black and white movie in silence as he slept. I returned to the station and sat back down, flicked the channels until I found the same black and white movie and began to watch. It's kind of ironic for the movie to be playing, as if a testament to the sleeping crook's evening, perhaps foretelling his future as well. 12 angry men played on the screen, just as a bunch of angry men had filled the unit only moments before. They weren't done yelling yet, not by a long shot, but I wouldn't be there to listen, not during the day. Perhaps I would return the following night to live through yet another episode of Let's Burn the Pedo. The final few hours ran the way I had hoped the rest of the night would, in relative silence, with a unit full of sleeping crooks and a dawn waiting to end another shift for me. And after the breakfast rounds and welfare checks are completed, the first of the day shift crew arrive, ready to take the reins from me yet again. It's not long after they arrive that I make my way out of the prison, return to my car, and prepare for the morning drive home. I sit in silence momentarily, simply staring at the entrance to the prison, a place I have entered hundreds of times. The incredible experiences I've witnessed have shocked me, surprised me, awoken me to the harsh reality of what truly happens behind the walls. And now that this series is almost finished, I hope I have opened your eyes to them as well. Thank you for reading Book 12 of this series. Want more? The new book, Prison Days, Screwed Up, is now available for pre-order. Afterward. I know how you feel. I really do. There's so much more you want to read, and now the author has gone and pulled the rug out from under you, leaving you hanging with nowhere else to turn for another dose of Prison Days. Or has he? Perhaps he hasn't been as upfront with you as he could have been. Maybe, just maybe, this isn't the end after all. At least not yet. There are a couple of other projects I'm working on when it comes to Prison Days. I've mentioned another offshoot series to inmates, titled Officers, a few times, and I'm hoping to start releasing them in the next few months. But there's one project I really want to pursue and share with you next, called Prison Days, Screwed Up. If you enjoyed these previous Prison Days books, then I hope this new one will give you a new insight into the series. Put simply, it's not a diary. It's not a day-to-day commentary about the goings-on. What this new book entails is me, from start to finish. In short, it's the role I performed, told from my own perspective. Remember how in Prison Days I tried to give you an unbiased and clear view of everything that happened? I always made sure to keep my own emotions out of things, to provide an unedited and clear account of the incidents and day-to-day happenings, so you could make your own mind up. Well, enough of that. It's time for you to come to my side of the fence and see just how officers handle prison life. Prison Days, Screwed Up, is from my perspective, from the very first moment I walked into the prison as a correctional officer through to the very last day of my career. It highlights my fears, my frustrations, my empathy and anger as I navigate my way through hell. It's the story of a journey told by me, in a way that takes you inside to experience events from the way I really experienced them. It's an opportunity for me to share some unique insights and reveal the dangers, heartache, fear, and loneliness of a job that's anything but what others portray it as. Think the cameras are there to watch the crooks? Guess again. If you think Prison Days was confronting, wait until you see the reality of a career that leaves many scarred, both physically and emotionally, with some traumatized forever. Prison Days Screwed Up is available for pre-order right now and will be available in November 2021. Getting back to the ending of Prison Days, I wanted to take a moment to thank you personally from the very bottom of my heart for taking this journey with me. It has been an exciting 3 years to bring you the entire series, and I wanted to find a way to make it memorable. That's why, in the coming weeks, a special edition hardcover set will be released, limited to just 100 units. Each set will be individually numbered, hand-signed by me, including an optional personalized message if you choose, plus presented in an exclusive slipcase. The complete collection will be presented in 3 hardcover books, each containing 4 months of the series. They will also feature brand new limited edition covers not seen before. I'm really excited for this set and will make it available very soon for pre-orders on my website at www.booksbysimonkking.com/limited-editions. If you, or someone you know, loves Prison Days, then this is the ultimate set to add to your collection. I really hope you've enjoyed this ride as much as I have. While this may be the end of Prison Days, it's not the end of this author, not by a long way. My fictional books continue to roll out, and I have quite a number of books on the horizon, including 2 new Max books, which some are calling as close to the real thing as you can get. I hope you will follow me one final time through this Prison Days journey. One final time to share my insights into this crazy experience some call a career. It's time to see what I really think, without all the niceties to keep things neutral. Until then, thank you for your continued support, and I can't wait to see you again soon. Simon King, 12th of May, 2021. You have been listening to Prison Days, The Second 6 Months by Simon King, narrated by Todd Waites. Text copyright 2021 by Simon King. This recording, production copyright 2021 by Simon King, was produced by Todd Waites in cooperation with Spoken Realms on the web at spokenrealms.com. Thank you for listening.